Good morning, everyone. Good morning. If I could, thank you. Who said that? Thank you very much. Yay, thank you very much. If I could ask others to please find their seats, and we'll get started. I am Sarah Rosen Wartell. I am privileged to be the president of the Urban Institute and also to welcome you here this morning on behalf not only of Urban, but of our great partner, the Citi Foundation. The Urban Institute conducts rigorous social science and economic research and tries to bring insights from that research to bear on solving real-world problems in a changing environment. From the time of our founding in 1968, one of Urban's central goals has been to help expand economic opportunity and mobility by finding pathways, especially for those on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. We like to say that at Urban we try to elevate the debate, bringing evidence to bear to strengthen practice and inform decision-making. I'm so pleased to be here with our partners at the Citi Foundation because of their commitment to these same goals. Under Brandee McHale's leadership, the Citi Foundation has been a consistent past and current supporter to Urban's efforts. And I want to give a special welcome to everyone in the room who are community progress makers. Boy, would I like that title. Increasingly, it's conventional wisdom that working across silos on coordinated, data-driven, place-based strategies is necessary for us to make change in our communities. But there are so few sources of support for that hard work of collaboration, providing the glue for place-based efforts. But the Citi Foundation gets it. Citi's Community Progress Makers Fund is an extraordinary $20 million two-year initiative to support high-impact community organizations that are driving economic opportunity. In addition to core operating support, Community Progress Makers have access to technical assistance from leading experts, and they're part of a learning cohort to share best practices. Today's public event and private convenings around it are part of Citi's effort to support these innovations. And at Urban, we're greatly thrilled to be part of this. Importantly, because not only are we able to provide data and analysis to support the Progress Makers' efforts, but we're able to learn from all of you and the other investments that Citi has made about what works in our communities. So let me do a couple of quick housekeeping matters, and then we will just set this up, and we'll then chat with Director Donovan. First, I want to say also welcome to our very significant online audience, those watching live and later archived. For those of you who are in the room and online, we encourage you to share your thoughts and observations on the day using the hashtag #PromoteMobility. And if you are online, there will be opportunities for questions for the three really terrific panels we have later, and you can send those to events@urban.org. If you're in the room, there are small cards on your seat, and please don't wait till the end to raise your hands and share those. There'll be people coming around the room throughout, so all you have to do is wave it like this, and we'll be feeding them to moderators as we go. So before I introduce Brandee, let me just provide a little bit of economic backdrop. The focus for our partnership with Citi is economic mobility, what works, and particularly in our cities to focus on inclusion. So many of our cities have increasingly thriving engines of growth, but not always do those engines bring everyone along. In fact, sometimes they can push people further away from the places of opportunity that we're here to talk about. So how do you take those places that aren't yet places of opportunity and strengthen them? And how do you make sure that the residents in those places are taking advantage and gaining from benefits from the growth that we're seeing? We're looking at those questions against a backdrop of some important economic trends. First, there's the ongoing impact of the Great Recession, which knocked millions of families off their track for quest for economic mobility. But the recession was more than simply a sort of a break in a pattern of growth. It actually accelerated a set of trends that are underlying endemic that we have to wrestle with. The great engine of middle-class growth in this society was the long-term employment with an institution that provided a complex set of benefits. And we know well that the changing nature of our relationships with employers means fewer people have that kind of economic stability that is the basis for mobility. Instead, there's a great deal of volatility in people's incomes and expenses that make it hard for them to get ahead. So, and we'll hear more about this, but yesterday's superb news on rising median wages, despite that, consistent job growth for 6 years has generally produced jobs that on average don't have the same benefits that earlier employment did. Compounding the massive changes in the labor market is the reconcentration of income. The really great news about yesterday was that we saw wage growth across the income scale and in particular at the bottom, but across the past 3 decades, we have seen sort of much of the growth happening at the top, with the top 1% of earners seeing real after-tax income grow at more than 6 times the rate of the middle 60% of wage earners. Another profound challenge has been the widening racial wealth gap. The financial recession and the housing market in particular just really sort of broke a trend that had been of rising wealth and assets for low-income families, and particularly families of color. I have lots of different statistics, but it's clear that most African-American Hispanic families have somewhere south of 10% of the assets of an average white family. And finally, as I said, we're seeing that economic growth is not enough, that a rising tide is not lifting all boats, and in fact, instead we see the emergence of what some call the Great Separation. While generally the economic recovery has done great things for many of American cities, with job growth and GDP growth, according to recent analysis by Brookings, 95 out of the 100 largest metros experienced growth, but only 8 of these metros saw growth and prosperity translate into improved economic inclusion. 80 of these metros saw median wages slip, while the share of workers earning extremely low wages increased in more than the share earning extremely low wages grew in over half of these cities. So again, I think yesterday's news suggests that we're starting to see some change in direction on those trends as well, but it poses the challenge. Now, they play out in disturbing ways. The first is an opportunity gap, which grows when low-income households, because of high housing costs, can't move to the areas of high opportunity. And within cities, particularly strong market cities, we're actually seeing increased levels of racial segregation between high-income households and other families. Obviously, we're seeing a growth in income inequality even within our strong market cities, which is made worse because of the supply of affordable housing is falling. Those at that bottom end don't have the same opportunities. And so increasingly, we're seeing that where you live has a lot to say. The research of Roz Chetty's and others, which we'll talk about, has a lot to say about your chances of getting ahead. And in fact, for many, the rungs of the ladder do tend to still get wider. But when we have a vibrant, healthy economy, we have something to hitch onto. And so that's the goal of today's discussion. How can we make that work in more places? We're going to have 3 panels that explore these issues. The first will be on connecting affordable housing with opportunity, the second on understanding the impact of the changing nature of work on mobility, and the third on how cities can grow inclusively. And we're going to start with a conversation with Director Donovan, who I'll ask Brandee McHale to introduce. Shaun is an urban favorite, renowned because he is the most aggressive user of data, research, and evidence in the federal government. Then we're going to end the day with the Attorney General Lynch, whose department one might not have first thought as being an important player in questions of economic opportunity and mobility in our communities, but she is presiding over a department at the end of an administration that really has come to understand the role of law enforcement and criminal justice in a new way and the integral way that it relates to the quality of life and the chance of opportunity for the residents of communities. So first, briefly, I'm going to turn it over to Brandee, and let me just say, having had Brandee as the funder that I've worked with now for many years, she is every nonprofit's favorite funder. And it's because she does something that's rare. She helps to make you better at what your goal is. And she understands that these are partnerships between funders and those who are delivering. And as a result, she has been one of the most dynamic leaders in the community development field and philanthropy for over 2 decades. In her new role as head of the Citi Foundation, not quite so new anymore, Brandee has led Citi to become one of the premier investors and partners in human communities. And as always, she's someone who keeps her eye on the prize. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Brandee McHale.
Today I said, oh, this is your life community development style. And then I got scared. I thought, this is my obituary. So no obituaries today. First, let me just say, on behalf of all my colleagues at Citi, we are so pleased to welcome you to today's event. It is really great to see so many new and old friends, and even some soon-to-be friends in the room. We know that these days, time is in such scarce supply, and we genuinely appreciate your choosing to devote the time to be here today, and more importantly, to participate and to join the conversation. As we get closer to the upcoming election, I continue to just be delighted and amazed that economic mobility is front and center in the national discourse. If we think back, we could have 2-3 years ago been gathered at a similar event like this, in a similar room, with some of the same faces, to discuss the need to raise this issue with so much greater urgency. But today's headlines are full of what we've known for a long time. A lack of mobility has profound social and economic impacts, and the growing wealth gap affects all of us. And we'll talk a lot about that during the day today. This isn't something that happened overnight, but people are now just beginning to more fully understand these trends. There is some good news. The data is getting better. We'll talk about that as well. But I think as equally as important is that we're getting the attention. The media is talking, policymakers are talking, funders are talking, voters are talking, and even, I know she's probably watching on the webcast right now, my mother in Weeki Wachee, Florida, is talking about it. But we invited you here this morning to talk about how we can stop doing so much talking and move from dialogue to action with much more velocity, from talk to tactics, from ideas to implementation, from research to results. There are solutions. Many of you in the room are on the front lines, serving our nation's most vulnerable populations and working harder than ever to both treat the symptoms of poverty and address the underlying causes. But the reality is, even with important upward trends, the level of need in our cities and our neighborhoods is exponentially greater than our current pace of progress. We live in a world today where automakers are inventing driverless cars. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Our telephones are no longer primarily for talking. Think about that. But where are our disruptive innovations in community development? As social and economic change agents, we can't move forward on autopilot, doing what we've always relied on. The world is changing rapidly, and we need to change as well. So today we'll take a look at some of those disruptive ideas. Maybe we'll even cook up a few of them right here in this room, and we'll unpack the latest research on what's happening, the impact we're having, and where we need to possibly pivot. We are so honored to be partnering with the Urban Institute, which brings decades of expert policy analysis and best-in-class research to the table. Urban Institute President Sarah Wartell is a friend and someone I've personally admired for a long time, and we actually want to thank the entire Urban Institute team who really stepped up and made today happen. So thank you for that. But research alone is not enough. We need executors who can move us to results. And so, as Sarah noted, I like to say, in the spirit of putting our money where our mouth is, Citi earlier this year selected 40 local change agents across 6 U.S. cities to receive Community Progress Maker Awards. Today's event, for those of you that don't know, is the first time that they're all gathered together in one room, and I'm looking forward to their input and hope that they are going to keep us from getting too theoretical. I'll put it in really plain terms, like, let's keep it real and not go into like philanthropy speak. And I invite and urge all of you to keep us very grounded so we can move from ideas to implementation, from research to results. So while the chatter these days, especially in these next important weeks, both pre and even more so possibly post-election, is a reminder that we have our work cut out for us, we should not forget there is strength in numbers. We are not alone. As Sarah pointed out, in addition to the 250 people that are live in the room today, there are hundreds of others joining via webcast. Hi, Mom. And thousands, and I dare say, if we do our job right today, possibly millions more that we can reach through social media using the hashtag Promote Mobility. We have so many incredible people here today. We had an abundance of acceptances to our invitation to speak, and I hope you will help me, here's my shameless plug, at Brandee McHale at Citi, in amplifying their message today. So please use your phones and help us to get on Twitter and start trending. And the list of incredible people begins with our next speaker, someone who knows a thing or two about actually getting things done, facing the challenges head on, and finding solutions. Shaun Donovan, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. From his time in New York City as the head of the Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development, to serving as HUD Secretary, and now today as OMB Director, Shaun understands the importance of building meaningful partnerships to get things done. His leadership and his commitment to ending homelessness and ramping up the federal commitment to affordable housing have, as Sarah said, been deeply informed by data, but also a commitment to concretely identifying what works and being bold enough when it's needed to talk about what's not working. Today we'll hear from Shaun in a conversation with Sarah about sustaining and building on our progress, about how we shoot for the moon and reframe the question from, can we actually do this, to how do we make it happen now? Please join me in welcoming Shaun Donovan and welcoming Sarah back to the stage. Thank you.
Hi again. How you doing?
It's good. Good to be back with my peeps.
Yep, you are definitely in, you always think OMB director, he's got the defense budget, he's got all these grand important things to worry about, Zika viruses and things. But you invite Shaun to talk about communities, and he's always the first one to show. And we really appreciate that. But let's first talk for a moment about the larger context in which we're doing this. You guys had a pretty good day yesterday in the administration, seeing the signs of the hard work paying off. And I'd love you to sort of just give everyone sort of a, beyond the headlines, a sense of what that means, and in particular what it means for some of the questions we'll talk about today.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And Sarah, just thank you for your leadership for so many years on these issues. And I think that that's where I'd like to start. For somebody who started volunteering in a homeless shelter in college and has been focused on this work. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s when we thought all our cities were dying. And somebody like you who spent decades focused on these issues, and all of you in this room, yesterday was the single best of these census reports in the history of the reports, right? More than 50 years. And yeah, that's worth cheering about. And so I started every meeting at OMB yesterday talking about this and saying thank you to the folks who are on the front lines and you never know their names, because it really does show that if we keep at it, if we do the things that we increasingly know are the right things that can make a difference in people's lives, we will make progress. And as you said, what's most encouraging about it is not just that we have average gains, the biggest single year gain in incomes, the biggest drop in poverty rates since 1968, the biggest, tied for the biggest reduction in uninsured in healthcare, but that the biggest gains are exactly where you'd want them to be. The biggest gains in income are at the low end of the spectrum. The biggest drops in poverty are African Americans, Latinos. We have the smallest wage gap between men and women now in the history of recording these numbers. We have only 9.1% of Americans, still far too many, who are uninsured. But the biggest gains are, again, for low-income folks, minorities. And so you really are seeing progress. And I would say, the focus was on that one report, but we are increasingly seeing data over a number of years now that show us that we're moving in the right direction. This was 2015 data. Before 2015, we had started to see wage growth growing faster than we've seen it in a long time. And again, fastest growth at the bottom. For 2016, all the numbers that we have so far show us that wage growth has continued, and that you really are starting to see not just as you said, the rising tide starting to lift all boats, but faster progress at the bottom than at the top. And so I think we should all pause and just celebrate, but also take heart in the fact that if we do the right things over a long period of time, and I think this president came into office, he said the other day, this is the reason I ran for office, is that I was seeing these trends in my community and communities around the country, this growing gap, growing inequality. And let's be honest about what it is. It's an erosion of the fundamental promise of America, right? No matter who you look like, what you look like, who you are, where you come from, that you can get ahead here. If we don't believe that's true, then we've got a big problem in this country. And what these numbers say is that maybe we can get back to a place where, as you eloquently said, we still got a ways to go, but moving in the right direction, and in the biggest leap we've made in a year since the numbers started, is pretty damn good news.
Well, congratulations too, because you were obviously from the start a central part of the team that has led us through pretty scary times. I remember leaving the White House to the Treasury building during 2009 and 2010, and that was not a good feeling. Just, you almost felt the weight of the world on the shoulders of your colleagues and yourself. So I hope it sounds like you are enjoying this a little bit.
I remember.
So I feel slightly bad about going back to the hard problems, but go ahead, tell your story.
I was just going to say, I remember, Mike Bloomberg had this famous bullpen set up at City Hall, and I remember all of us sitting in this bullpen watching the first vote on the financial rescue package fail on the floor of the House. And just as it became clear it was going to fail, Mike Bloomberg walked into the room, and it was dead quiet, and he said, "The world is ending." So I remember that too.
Yes, there were nights when people thought we ain't gonna make it till tomorrow. So now the question, the world is doing a lot better, and I want to talk a little bit about place, and then we'll come back to this question about inclusion, particularly how do you include in places people on growth. So I think it's fair, you and I just had an interesting discussion about the difficulty in the federal government, which is not oriented towards place, right? We have federal streams of funding and lots of different programs. How do you build a respect for and understanding of how to work and support place-based efforts? You guys have started that effort and really changed some things in government, but there's lots left to do.
So I think there are three pieces to this at a very broad level that I think it's important we all recognize. First, that there is a baseline of our safety net in this country that no matter where you live, who you are, if you struggle, and lots of folks are going to struggle at some point in their lives, it's enormously important that we have that safety net in place. And it's not place specific, but it's incredibly important to the places where folks are struggling the most. And so we've had a big focus on not just sort of stopping the erosion in that safety net, but actually expanding it. And there are thousands of ways that we've tried to do it, but I think the bottom line is part of what we're seeing in the numbers yesterday, and something that got a lot less attention. We saw the biggest drop in childhood food insecurity in 1 year that we've seen on record this past year as well. And that's because we've done a ton of stuff to make SNAP benefits, like summer SNAP programs and school feeding programs, and a whole set of things that don't get a lot of attention, but collectively have really strengthened the safety net. The earned income tax credit, a whole range of different things that are critically important. So I think even though we're place people, we ought to just recognize that we should be voices for the broad programs that aren't necessarily place specific. Second, we got to get past this old, tired, like, does people or place matter more? Should we be helping folks move out of, places that don't have opportunity, or should we be fixing the, yes, the answer is yes, both. And let's go do it and stop arguing about it, right? And so I think we've really tried to bring that spirit that we care about both. And then the third thing I would say is that one of the things and look, this is where I start to show my wonkiness, that if I haven't shown it before, but the fact is that one of the most amazing things that we can, after the numbers we saw yesterday, right, but we've started to see evidence that these things work, and not in 2% changes, but massive changes in life opportunity if you're doing the right thing. You mentioned Raj Chetty's work. Hello, housing vouchers mean a third difference in income if you're moving to the right neighborhoods. That's results that nobody could have dreamt of. When we were putting together Moving to Opportunity, the early results were really disappointing in a lot of places. But then you see things like mental health and physical health, particularly for women and girls, off the charts changes. And then it really is this sort of data analysis and evidence stuff that starts to show us, well, you got to wait 10 or 20 years, but it's really, so it's the stuff that I think we knew in our bones, but we didn't have the evidence to walk into a congressman or a mayor's office and say, look, this stuff really can make a difference. And so I think we really need to keep pushing and hold ourselves accountable to what works and what doesn't. And I think we've started to put that infrastructure in place too. So I think that's a very 30,000-foot view of, I think, the attitude the president brought in and that we brought in at the beginning of the administration. I think there's a lot that we've tried to do as well, which I hope we'll come back to, not just on the what are the policies, but the how. How do we really start to customize the way the federal government works in places? And that's a critical part of this as well.
Well, so that's where I'd love to go next, because if you think about, I remember one of the earliest things that you worked on was sustainable communities, and that was a partnership across agencies, and we were part of an evaluation that looked at how well that worked, and one of the key things that found was it was all about leadership. It was because you and your counterparts in the agencies believed it, that the career infrastructure also then found ways to start to work together and deliver strategies on the ground. And from the community's perspective, having funding streams that at least were willing to be part of a conversation about figuring out how the rules could change to make that work is pretty important. How, as you think about the end of this administration and leaving for the next, I know you've been thinking about, how do you kind of build that into the DNA to some extent so that the next team is able to build and deepen that support for communities and not have to start all over again in learning that?
Yeah. So maybe I want to take a little bit of a long way to get back to this question of how you institutionalize it, because I want to start with, well, what is it we're trying to institutionalize in the first place? And so I think the way to start this is like, it's a week after the election in 2008, and I go out like with very little sleep for a number of days because I'm nervous as hell to meet with the president-elect to interview to be HUD secretary. And I walk in, I have like 45 minutes alone with the president. And like what became immediately clear, first of all, is like this is the most thoughtful president we've ever had on these issues. And for him, it was like, okay, I started as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago, and the federal government that I saw wasn't so helpful, right? The president saw. And that really matched my experience, to be frank, Valerie Jarrett's experience, Arne Duncan. We had a lot of people who had come out of working, Kathleen Sebelius as a governor, that often, put it this way, if sitting as housing commissioner in New York, if I'm thinking, I want to figure out the most innovative way to figure out what to do in this neighborhood or this community, the first thing that came to mind wasn't like, I'm going to call the federal government and get, solutions, right? And that's painting with a very broad brush. There are amazing people in the federal government, but I don't think we were structured or set up to approach this as we're partners in problem solving, right? Just the setup you guys did for what you're trying to do today wasn't always the attitude we brought. And I think, just to sort of be a little more historical about this, if you go back to the Great Society, right? Huge pushes, big expansion of really important fundamental benefits. But a lot of the attitude of the federal government was, hey, this community is a problem. It's a cancer to be cured. We're going to go in, whether it's urban renewal or public housing, we're going to sort of wipe the slate clean and then start again. And we know what's best, right? And as a trained architect, like I have the picture books of HUD employees in the Beltway in DC designing pattern books for public housing, right? There's a reason it all looks the same, right? And so it's an example of the fact that there was this sort of one-size-fits-all approach, even though there was really important progress. And the reaction to that was the sort of federalism devolution of like, the federal government's the problem, let's just give it all to the states and localities. And I think the attitude the president came in with was, no, there's a middle ground here where what we start with is we want to be a strong but humble partner, right? We want to disrupt this old sort of top-down approach and start with what does the community say is their vision, not our vision, making sure, holding the community accountable, say, look, we're going to work with what you want to do, but you've got to have everybody at the table. You've got to have a serious long-term plan. We're then going to organize ourselves at the federal government to be coordinated, so you don't have to talk to 15 different agencies to get an answer. You can go to one person and we can coordinate ourselves. And then we're really going to use data and evidence to make sure that you're making progress. And so those are sort of the hallmarks. And part of that, frankly, like to my point about like going to the federal government for answers, like we should have answers, right? We're operating in every community in the country, right? So if you've got a particular problem in your neighborhood and you want it, this is what I wanted to know in New York, right? I want to steal the best ideas that are out there. You're operating in these communities, why can't you come to, and so we've really tried to bring that innovation and the evidence-based stuff and not just help to work in one community, but to spread it across communities. And so I think those have been sort of the hallmarks of the approach. And I think we've really started to see it work. We're really trying to now institutionalize it. I think what is going to your point, to get back to your question where you started.
You always have a good time along the way.
I do think that the hope is that we're starting to do it in a lot of places. The challenge that remains is, can we do it everywhere? And I can talk about some of the things that we've started to do institutionalize it, but I do think there is a big question that remains of, can we get to every place? And we literally have been meeting with the president talking about this and are starting to put together ideas and would love your ideas and folks here about what are the best ways to institutionalize this so that it is kind of standard operating procedure for the federal government, not just a set of initiatives in we're now in 1,800 communities doing this. So we've gotten to a lot of places, but to try to do it everywhere.
So I'm going to come back to the what's not done
Yeah.
in a minute, because I suspect if we were to ask around in some of the communities,
one or two things.
there are one or two who haven't yet experienced the idealized federal government quite
Yeah.
yet.
Nah. You think?
Maybe. But I want to talk about the tools in the tool belt that you use in doing that.
Yep.
There are a set of issues, whether it's post-secondary education, obviously we're going to talk a lot about community economic development here, asset building programs, housing is obviously a critical platform for a lot of this. And we'll talk later about criminal justice too, and with the burn programs and other things, DOJ's been a partner in this really for the first time, and now thinking about community trust and policing, there's a different, beginning to be a different way of thinking about their role in some of these conversations. But where do you feel like the ability to work in place is stronger, and where yet have we not gotten all the way there?
Do you mean where geographically or where?
Well, I was initially
issues?
asking which issues in that set of tools or others. Do you feel like we've gotten a little bit better at being supportive of communities and having a more customized experience of tools that are usable and different strategies led in different places?
Yeah, so I think generally what I would say is where this is working best, just about every one of those agencies and those issues are present. And I think and this is a challenge I think to all of us, what's hard about telling the success story is that if you are customizing, it is going to look different in different places. So I would say we're focused on different levels of geography too. I think there are regional success stories. There are lots of really good examples, I think, of transportation and where, and part of this is the changing dynamic of regions where, you used to have hollowing out central cities that sort of, the suburbs didn't want to work with them. You now have a reversal of that, and so we got the wind at our backs to some degree. But you've got places like Denver and Salt Lake and others where you've built these amazing regional transit systems, and we've really been able to connect that in, and I give Anthony Fox and Ray LaHood a lot of credit. We've been able to connect that into a real opportunity frame where we're saying, how do we use what is a growing regional strong transit system to make sure we're getting into neighborhoods that have the least opportunity, with a real specific plan. The sustainable communities example is a good one where we were making sure and saying, look, we're gonna make money available, but you've got to bring folks who aren't usually at the table to the table to be part of this conversation. And so I feel very good that, for example, in transportation, at the regional level and at the local level, we've started to really drive this conversation home. I think at the citywide level, we have some very good examples. Detroit, I think New Orleans, Fresno, where we've really started to tie in a set of things. And a lot of these are agencies, to your point, who don't think of themselves as places. So take the Detroit example. Lighting, right? Over half the streetlights in the city were out. And again, it was this thing of, the mayor came to us and was like, look, I just need money to do streetlights. And we came back and said, well, how about this? We've got a model of a streetlight that is being used in other places that will cut your energy bills by millions of dollars, lower your emissions by the equivalent of 11,000 cars on the street, and can be a platform for Wi-Fi and all of these other technologies that, and he's like, whoa, that sounds pretty good. And so now they're close to having relit the entire city using a different kind of streetlight that, unless the Department of Energy, do they think of themselves as place-based? No, but we were able to tie them into this effort because the mayor said to us, this is the problem I need to solve. And then we organized our team around it. So there's some unusual, Fresno's another good example where the mayor said, look, my biggest problem is I've got this downtown mall that has really hollowed out, and the very center of my city is, lowering opportunity rather than increasing it. And we went to the General Services Administration, right? Place-based? No way. And said, hey, do you have any federal agencies in the region that are moving? What about putting them in this building that the mayor says is there? So my point is there are a set of issues where I think education is another one where on the neighborhood level, we're really starting to see gains in San Antonio and Los Angeles, graduation rates. So education is really place-based. They're hiring folks that can be community-facing folks across the country. So they get it in a deep way. But we've also been able to bring agencies and tools that aren't that far along on the spectrum of place-based yet, but if we organize ourselves in the right way, we can go grab them and bring them to the table to solve a particular problem that the local community says they need solved.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and that gives you a chance to wander through whichever parts of these questions you want to answer. The first thing that we haven't really explored yet is this challenge of inclusion and how different it is in different places. Bob and Ebeli and I were just talking about Bed-Stuy, right? Here's this healthy, neighborhood that is, literally the founding place of the community development movement in many ways with Bed-Stuy restoration, and yet still has many challenges, but is under enormous pressure from the health, in some ways, the rising property values that are all surrounding it. And then there are places like Detroit where despite some, there's great fatality at the core again because of some unusual circumstances. But, many other cities like Cleveland and others where you just have vast parts of the city that are depopulated and are just very difficult to manage. Making sure that economic benefits in each of those places, whether it's the energy at the core in Detroit, or if it's the broader engine that is New York City, making sure that those economic growth bring people along and don't actually push them further aside is the central challenge. The second question that you can think about is what are the big challenges that your successors are going to have to tackle in thinking about place? And what words of wisdom or what agenda setting are you going to leave behind on the desk for the next people to come?
Yeah. So on the first question, look, I think this is exactly why it can't be one size fits all, right? Is because the challenges are so different in different places. And one thing we haven't talked about here is that I mentioned, growing up in New York City when, we thought our biggest challenges were urban challenges, right? In many ways, it's sort of an amazing story of resurgence of our cities, most cities, not all. But the flip side of that is in rural communities, we're seeing some really problematic trends. The fact that life expectancies are going down for low-income whites. And so there's not only the differences between urban areas, but there's the urban-rural differences. And
outer ring suburbs, which are increasingly becoming the place where
sort of what we used to think of as urban challenges, right? So I think that does go to this point of really trying to customize and I think on the one hand, what we have to do, and this is something that the president is increasingly, and we in the administration are increasingly focused on, is that the problems of success, because of the urban resurgence we're seeing in a lot of places, is something that we have to really have a national conversation about. I mean, one of the concerning things we're seeing, and I think this really goes to the risk of inequality growing, there are trends we saw for many decades. We're starting to see good numbers, but we have to keep pushing. And the fact is, low-income folks are having a harder and harder time moving into communities where there is opportunity, right? Because rents are rising. It's something that is remarkable in a lot of communities in not a good way. I saw this in New York, but it's now something that we're seeing in more places. And so you're going to have an interesting conversation, I think, today. There aren't a ton of federal levers on land use. We have budget proposals that say, there's a $300 million grant proposal where we're saying, let's give communities money with requirements that they look at zoning codes, inclusionary zoning, a whole range of things. We've already started to connect it. If you're going to get transit grants, we're going to require you to show that you have a plan around zoning so that this is a community. You're going to create economic pressure through where you locate the stops. Show us that you have a plan to make sure low-income folks can move to these places with good access to transit in the future, right? So there are tools that we have.
Fair housing is another.
Fair housing is a very good one, and we have to make sure that we're using our levers, but we also have to really lift up this conversation. There are examples, California's by right development, which was Carol Galante and I were talking about last night. Disappointing that it didn't make it across the finish line, but those are the kind of bold conversations we need to be having. On the flip side, I think in Detroit, you talked about fair housing, I think this is a really good example where we have to be asking every community, what are your strategies to make sure that growth is inclusive and shared? I think a big step we've taken forward with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is to start from the place of giving communities the data. I will say, there are a set of communities we read about in the newspaper that are dead set against letting low-income folks in and dead set against, getting to better racial balance in their communities. But that's not the majority. The majority of these communities, I think, frankly, are generally interested, don't really know the data, and a big part of what we're starting with is saying, you've got to look at really where the opportunity is, and in a very fine-grained way. We've set that up so they have easy access to it to say, not just on race, but health, education, transit, all of these things. And then you've got to come back with a specific plan, which we'll help you with. So it's, again, being a partner where I think we've started to do that. Lastly, to the point of sort of building in this infrastructure, I think, I talked about the 1,800 communities earlier. I think that the key things, first and foremost, this is about people. And the truth is, for most folks in the federal government, they came to this work for the right reasons, right? They wanted to make a difference in communities. And it's often the, regs and the rules and the kind of siloed nature of our work that stops them from being. So a lot of this is us getting out of the way, I think, of letting our people do the right, but also encouraging them in the right way. So first, we are hiring a bunch of people with the specific job of being progress makers in their community, to steal a
Federal
phrase.
progress makers. We're going to.
And to me, this is, I used to describe this, we did this first with our Strong Cities, Strong Communities effort. We took a federal person who was lead for that community, put them in the mayor's office, and said, your job is to help there. I used to I compare it to the bat phone. I'm dating myself here, but remember Commissioner Gordon used to have the cake plate on his desk with the red phone? That's what that person is supposed to do. You can pick up the phone, call that person, and they can get anyone in the federal government, any issue. Like, the answer may be no, but we're going to get you an answer quickly, and hopefully the answer is usually yes, and we're going to be creative. That's what that lead person is. And these mayors loved this. They were like, this is amazing. Like, and they were desperate when these folks rotated out. They were like, no, you got to get me that person back. there was a real sense that here was somebody from the federal government that was on their side, right? It was the person that Barack Obama, as a community organizer, would have wanted on the south side of Chicago. And so we're hiring a lot of those folks. We're training them. We've now run 3 trainings. We're about to run the 4th to really help them. What are the tools to break down silos? What are the tools to be a progress maker in your community? And I'd love to see that get to, we've put together, this sounds, boring, but it's really important. We've put every general counsel for all the agencies that work on place-based stuff together to figure out how to, like a model agreement, to deliver technical assistance in a coordinated way across agencies, right? That's something that we've done. So those are all kind of pieces that we've started to build in the infrastructure. I think the question then for the next administration will be, how do we take this everywhere, right? We've trained hundreds. We'd like to get to thousands. Could we get to millions of federal employees trained in being progress makers? could we end up where every single community in the country has a bat phone, right? And how do we organize at the neighborhood level, at the city level, at the regional level, and then at the federal level to make sure that we have structures in place that coordinate across agencies? I think a really good example, on homelessness, we've done this, right? We made remarkable progress. Veterans homelessness is down by about half since the president came into office. And a lot of that is the Interagency Council on Homelessness and similar state level, community level organizations. And so those are the kinds of things, not comprehensive, but those are the types of things that I think are the infrastructure of placemaking for the federal government that we want to do as much as we can by January 20th, and then hopefully we can continue to build on. And shameless plug, you guys are the folks that can make it happen. Like, I'm not necessarily the person the next administration is going to be listening to, right? And I'll do what I can, but the most important thing is that there's a constituency for this stuff that's really saying to the next president, the next OMB director, the next HUD secretary, all the cabinet, like, this is really important work that we need to continue.
Well, I think what we just saw there was the combination of eternal optimism with a real understanding and knowledge of practical things on the ground. And I think in some ways we have a challenge for the rest of the day. Not only should we be thinking about what can we do to be best practices across places, but what are the things that we want to ask our federal government to do to support us so that our bat phones don't have to get a bespoke answer each time, but in fact that when we call, there is a set of tools on hand to help and support. So maybe that can be yet another challenge for us for today. I'm going to ask you I'm going to invite up the next panel, Marge Turner, who is the Senior Vice President at the Urban Institute, and I like to say the Intel chip. She is the brains of the place and tells me and others how not to screw it up. Is going to lead a really terrific panel looking at housing. But before they come up, please join me in thanking Director Donovan. I keep wanting to call you Secretary Donovan. You're still a HUD secretary.
That was quick. Good morning. I'm going to just transition us to the next segments of our agenda, which will involve 3 moderated conversations about both the evidence and what it takes to put the evidence into action. And for each of these conversations, we're joined by some terrific people, both researchers and practitioners, who are going to kick off the conversation, first about housing, then about work, and then about inclusive cities. But everybody will have an opportunity to join those conversations. These are the kickoffs of the conversations. Those of you who are in the room have cards to put questions on, and people will be going around to pick up those cards so that they feed into the conversation. And if you are participating online, you should submit your questions to events@urban.org. So for our first panel, we're focusing on where we live. And on the challenges of producing and preserving affordable housing in communities that have the assets and the resources required to support economic mobility for their residents. And I'm really excited about the chance this morning to be learning from Carol Galante, who's currently a professor of affordable housing and urban policy at UC Berkeley, but just recently was the assistant secretary in the Office of Housing at HUD, so a researcher and a practitioner. And Jackie Alexander, who's the director of development in the Mid-Atlantic region for the Community Builders, which is a premier mission-driven real estate development corporation, really does this work on the ground every day. And full bios for all of us are in your packets. So most of us take it for granted that if we want to provide a really secure foundation for our kids' health and their development and their future success, that we need to be able to provide them with a home that is in good, decent physical condition and that has a rent or a mortgage payment that we can afford to sustain over time so that we can give them stability in that decent home. And we've already heard a little mention of Raj Chetty's work, which, in my view, extends and reinforces a substantial body of evidence telling us that where that home is located, where we live, really matters to the long-term life chances of our kids. And again, I think this is something that families with resources kind of take for granted and act on intuitively. But this latest evidence provides really compelling data showing that every year of exposure to a more opportunity-rich community improves a child's chances of economic success as an adult by substantial amounts, not trivial amounts. And in addition, the evidence is strong that living in a profoundly distressed neighborhood undermines long-term outcomes, not just for one generation, but in fact across generations. So an agenda that cares about economic mobility and economic mobility for everybody really has to tackle, I think, 3 housing-related challenges, big challenges. And the first of those is figuring out how to expand the availability of affordable housing in opportunity-rich places that for too long have actually excluded low-income people, particularly families of color, from those opportunity-rich environments. The second big challenge is revitalizing distressed communities so they too can support economic opportunity. And the third is preserving affordable housing in revitalizing communities. So when our revitalization work takes root and begins to pay off, how do we preserve affordable housing options so that the low-income residents who were there originally and subsequent generations of low-income residents can really reap the benefits of the investments that we've made? Too often, I think, people see those 3 challenges, those 3 imperatives, as being in competition with one another. And as Shaun said, we spend too much time arguing about which of those we should do when the answer is yes. And I feel very strongly that cities and regions have to be pursuing all 3 of those strategies at once. The combination in which you pursue them is going to really depend on the circumstances of the city and the region. But we got to be pursuing all 3 at once if we want to make sustainable progress towards ensuring that every family can find an affordable place to live in a community that supports their kids' future success. So that's a lot more easily said than done. As a researcher, I get to say it, but I know that it's extremely challenging to do. So we're going to start this conversation with the challenge of building affordable housing, expanding the availability of affordable housing in communities that are already opportunity rich. And I thought Carol could sort of introduce what does the evidence tell us about that challenge and, more importantly, how to tackle it, how to overcome it.
Sure, great. Thanks, Marge. Thanks for having me here. This is an incredibly challenging issue, and I love, I still call him Secretary Donovan, not Director Donovan, Secretary Donovan's optimism about a number of these issues. Being on the front line sometimes, both from a research perspective as well as policy development and as a former practitioner, I guess sometimes I lose a little bit of that optimism and do believe that one of the big challenges to moving to opportunity is the restrictive zoning issues that we have in many, many communities. And there's lots of good evidence. There was a UCLA study just this year that talked about how, income inequality is worse when you have density restrictions on zoning. And you have to think about why do you have those kinds of restrictions to opportunity. And just to step back, the reason it's important, in my view, is we have to solve this affordable housing problem in the context of, in at least the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., many of the communities that are represented as part of the Citi collaborative here, these are communities that are growing in general. Their population is growing, and and their jobs are growing. So we have to grow these regions and these communities for everyone. And at the same time, be sure that we're providing opportunities for people at the lower end of the income spectrum, but we have a lot of people to house. So if I could just say one more word about that and then go back to the challenges, we have a new postdoctoral fellow at the Turner Center who studied under Richard Green at USC, and she just did an analysis of the LA region that the adult population of the region grew 15.8% by natural population growth between 2000 and 2012. 17% of that in young people who are the ones that are forming households, right, and need a place to live. So it goes back to Shaun's point of, where are people going to live? And 30% of that population is from people living longer. So people are staying in place, aging in place, taking up room. Sorry, but so all of this means, back to the zoning, we've got to add to the supply, the overall supply of housing in these regions, and so we need to have planning processes that enable that to happen, both from a zoning perspective, a density perspective. And that's, the research is clearly telling us that we're going to continue to have inequality if we don't do that. The one last thing I would say that the evidence shows us is that why you have some of those exclusionary practices is the community opposition is real. And that community opposition comes from people who already have theirs, and they don't really see the benefit of adding to the supply of new housing in their community. That just means more traffic, that just means more kids going to the schools, it means all these other issues to them, and I have mine, why do I need to open up? And a good example of some of the evidence here is in California, we have something called the California Environmental Quality Act, and other states and communities have other kinds of processes in place to constrain development. But in California, 71% of the CEQA lawsuits, so stopping projects, and this happens to be in Southern California, stopping projects, 71% of the lawsuits are against higher density infill developments, and only 2% are against single family sprawl developments, right? So there's an opposition that is real, unless you all think that opposition is just from wealthy white Republicans. Matthew Kahn of UCLA actually did a study recently that showed liberal-leaning cities actually have fewer permits for new development than more conservative political cities. So, everybody needs to take responsibility for the not in my backyard kind of opposition that we need to overcome if we're going to add to the supply of both, market rate, which the income problem is, or the housing affordability problem is going way up the income scale, so the market needs to be able to work for people more at the moderate end of the scale. And it's really important that we fix that. So one of the things that we're doing in California is as Shaun mentioned, working on state kinds of influences, mandates to help localities with carrots and sticks get to a point where they are actually approving new development that includes a percentage of affordable housing. And we're going to keep working on those kinds of issues because we think they're really important.
It's another example of working at multiple scales. So it's not just a fight over one development at a time in one community at a time.
Exactly. Exactly. Giving the ability of the local community to say, you know what, this comes from, we just put out a paper at the Turner Center on Massachusetts 40B and what it did in terms of requiring localities to all have a certain amount of affordable housing. And if they don't, then a developer comes forward with a project, it gets to go bypass the local discretionary review process and go to a state appeals board. So we're proposing another idea for some other states is to emulate some of those kinds of things. Sometimes the local council may want to do the right thing, but they have, they're not going to get reelected if they quote do the right thing. So it's easier if you say to them, they can say to their constituency, you know what, I really didn't want to approve that project, but I didn't have any choice, right? So they can defer and hide behind a higher power.
So Jackie, maybe you could talk a little bit about not both what these challenges, how these challenges play out in practice, but also again, how do we get past them? How do we overcome them?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for such a wonderful, wonderful event. As a nonprofit developer, we are national, but we are. Good morning. I'm on? Okay, thank you. So as a nonprofit national developer, we are pretty much a nonprofit that came out of a local CDC in South Boston. So our roots are really grounded in community organizing and local community development. So, having worked in many high opportunity areas within New York City, that's my background, and more so with community builders, some of the challenges that we've had is you're in these high opportunity markets now that are hot and popping, right? They're very expensive. That's really what's going on is in order to acquire a parcel of property, you're talking about a high acquisition price, which when you're looking at a high acquisition price and really trying to build an affordable project or a mixed income project, what are the financing tools that are available to you to accomplish that? It's limited. And it's always some challenges in terms of whether you're using 4% or 9% tax credits, and then you're relying on your local or locality for some gap financing. So those are some of the challenges that we face. But localities that have been able to deal with this issue have actually utilized their own resources and assets. And I think that's one of the lessons learned in New York City. Since the 70s, when they had their in-rem foreclosure process where they acquired not only vacant land, but buildings, occupied buildings, and so forth, they controlled a very valuable asset that really set the game plan for community development and just improving the neighborhoods within New York City. And I think some cities are now catching on to that. I mean, that's something that New York has, I think, gotten to the point where there's very little city-owned property left. And so now the challenges that are faced here within the district, right, where there's limited district assets that they're, have these high acquisition costs. But now here within the district, as we're, facing some really great challenges with trying to find affordable housing for the number of residents that are being displaced by such the high activity here, the district is actually leveraging its own properties, which is something that I think is great and it's needed. And other localities are understanding that. Within the city of Baltimore, they have access to a lot of properties and they've seen that the quality of housing has been poor, and so have been trying to look at strategies of, how can we acquire and assemble properties to help spur development activities. But overall, I mean, the challenges that we all face are high acquisition costs within these high opportunity areas that you can actually get access in a quick turnaround time to acquire properties that will then leverage the number of units that you really want to contribute to affordable housing. So it is, you have to jump in very quickly and you have a quick turnaround time in order to acquire the properties. There are a lot of our intermediary partners that have put together acquisition loan funds so that we can quickly, as nonprofits, organize and be competitive with the for-profit developers who can act quickly within these markets. But I mean, it's some real challenges, but I think that working with the localities on creating different tools and resources, depending on each area, because they are very different, I think has been the success of organizations.
Great. That's great. I want to invite people, if you have questions, to put them on the card that you've got, or if you're online, events@urban.org. And we'll keep talking for a little while, but we can incorporate some questions if you've got them. An issue that flows out of your experiences, from my perspective, is how do we change the narrative, change the fears of opportunity-rich communities, the communities where people feel that, they've invested, they've put their savings on the line to live in a safe community with great schools. How do we change the narrative so that the notion of incorporating some more density, allowing some growth, and being more inclusive doesn't undermine the values, the success of that community? So I'm assuming we make those arguments on a project-by-project basis. How do we also make those arguments more broadly if we're thinking where this work is going to go over the next decade or more? Maybe Jackie, you could.
Sure. I think that in the work that we've done, the data has shown that when you bring in affordable housing and mixed income housing, and you're actually stabilizing the market, that helps increase property values. You're bringing stability, eyes on the street. You're improving neighborhoods. We've seen that in New York. We've seen that throughout in other cities, in Chicago and in Boston. I think the challenges that some of in more recent years, that it is folks have now had their success and they want to protect their neighborhoods. But in order for you to protect your neighborhood, you need to have a workforce that has easy access, that is going to be living among us, right? That's just the nature of having an integrated community in a neighborhood. That is what is part of the American fabric, right? It's having people of diverse incomes and being able to have quality, affordable housing. It is a challenge in some markets, but by staying firm as knowing who your local stakeholders are as part of this larger conversation, you have to approach it from a neighborhood transformation. So it's not a project-by-project initiative. It really is looking at a neighborhood and working with your local stakeholders to say, this is what this neighborhood needs. And although you may be across the street in an upper income neighborhood, you know what? Your safety, your income values, your home values only become more improved as you have more diversity of housing next door. And so it's a little bit foolish because we have the intel and we have the data that shows that the efforts that we have all been doing since the 80s when tax credits came into effect, that it really is showing that this is stabilizing neighborhoods and allowing communities to be diversified. In Harlem, I'm a Harlemite, born and raised, and it is the tax credit portfolio that came in that stabilized the neighborhood, that allowed the mixed income, that allowed the market rate for sale home ownership that has skyrocketed, that is also seen within Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. But it's a story that has to be told, that what we're doing is really truly stabilizing communities.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things. I think all of that is right, and there are a number of studies on property values and what affordable housing, quote unquote, does or does not do in terms of helping property values. And I think one of the most important things there is that well-managed affordable housing contributes positively to property values in neighborhoods, and continuing to show that kind of evidence is important, but also being sure that we have developments that are of a high quality standard that meet those tests are important. The other thing I would say is I am just off the new development and thinking more about just accessing the opportunities that already exist in high opportunity neighborhoods. Adding to accessory dwelling units in single family neighborhoods. I mean, we did a study that showed that the number of people per bedroom in a single-family home has dropped significantly. So you're
It's
not...
definitely dropped in my single family.
Yes, and dropped in my single-family home, which is what gave me the idea to actually look at the data and say, wait a minute, you know, people are saying we're densifying if we're adding accessory dwelling units. Well, you're not actually densifying in terms of population, because in 1970 you had 6 people living in this house, and now you have 2. So, you know, add a little, you know, just reconfigure the home, and you can add people. And thinking about those niche kinds of, they sound nichey, and you know, the community builders isn't going to want to go out and do accessory dwelling units, but I think we have to be thinking about those kinds of strategies in these high opportunity areas as well. They tend to be mostly single family home neighborhoods. And so yes, we need to do more multifamily zoning. Yes, we need to get more higher density in the commercial corridors, but we also need to find a way to create the access in the housing stock that we already have in these neighborhoods. And that's demand side, accessory dwelling units, expanding, I wouldn't say necessarily vouchers, but demand side type support for people to live in those communities.
Great.
I just wanted to add, because Carol really hit on a point that's very important, the look and feel of affordable housing and what it looks like and how it's being maintained. I think it's a big challenge for us when we're trying to produce quality housing. It costs, and that's real. And where you have limited resources that are available in terms of your 9% and 4% in volume cap, and limited resources with localities in terms of their capital funds and so forth, you want to produce a high-quality looking building that's energy efficient, that has all the appropriate bells and whistles, that it's going to survive the next 15, 30, 40 years, and that it's a quality asset within the community. Having folks understand that and seeing renderings and then bringing that to fruition is always a bit of a challenge, right? Because folks want to have low cost, and cost limits on construction, where in each state is very different. That is a huge challenge. But the more that we push that affordable housing and mixed income housing should look and be quality housing is very important.
So one of the questions that we've gotten from the audience is really, what of these arguments work at the state level? How do you sort of make the case to state government to be that constructive force with respect to local government? And this questioner says, we have a Republican governor and legislature.
Tough. Difficult. You know, I would just say it hasn't worked yet in California, so I'll be, you know, really clear, but I think what has captured people's attention is this population growth issue. So again, providing the evidence that people are here. This isn't just new people moving into your community. People are here, they're being, you know, generated naturally, and you want jobs, and you want the growth from jobs, and so housing is infrastructure too, and we need to find ways to create that infrastructure, and education's infrastructure, and we need to have those two things working together. The thing that really worked to capture people's minds in California is environmental goals. Mm-hmm. So we have very ambitious climate change goals, and we aren't going to house all this population in the places where we want in terms of meeting climate change goals if we also aren't addressing this opportunity issue, right? Otherwise, it's going to be the drive till you qualify problem, and that doesn't work from an environmental perspective. So I think thinking about accessing your other sectors, the environmental sector, the business community, you know, people need workers. They want to continue to expand and grow their job base in your community, but if people don't have quality housing and they don't have quality education to take those jobs, you know, you might be moving your job base somewhere else.
And again, this is another example, I think, particularly with respect to environmental protections, that people have sometimes thought, you know, the environmental goals are in tension with the affordability goals, but figuring out ways to link those objectives together gives us a lot more traction. So I'm going to slide us to the very closely related question of preserving affordable housing options in neighborhoods where revitalization has started to take off and housing market pressures are getting intense, and we risk displacement of people who lived in the neighborhood originally or who might come to the neighborhood next. And next couple of questions really zoom in on that. But maybe we should start this time with Jackie. Many of the issues, like being able to move quickly and acquire land, seem to me comparable. But I wonder if there are some particular issues around preservation in higher density, revitalizing neighborhoods from your experience.
Sure. I think there are some serious challenges with it. But the great thing is that you have an asset. You have a property that's already there. And some of the challenges may be that from its physical needs may be very extensive. And how do you, again, going back to financing, how do you really bring that property and the housing stock up to 2016 standards that have the environmental requirements and the green requirements for sustainability and so forth. Some of the other challenges, not just in terms of the physical aspect, is how looking at really what are the needs of those residents. I think sometimes when we go and we look at an asset, we're just looking at it from just a building, but there are truly residents there. And what is their story? What are their needs? And I think with us as a nonprofit organization, what we try to understand are, how can we help provide not only an improvement in the housing itself, but how can we help better the residents' lives? And we've learned from all of our other programs that when you just focus on housing, that's one-dimensional. It really is, if the residents are in need of access to childcare, education, job training, mental health counseling, or better access to health care, you really have to look at those needs of the residents. And I think for us, what we like to do is complement and do outreach for different type of resident service programs to help link those to be more, to have a more successful community. And so for us, we have a community life program which really focuses on the needs of the residents. So when you're looking at preservation, you're looking at residents that have been in these buildings for some time, multi-generation. Sometimes it's 2 and 3 generations of families that are living in one unit. How do you begin to address the needs of those residents and really craft programs that are targeted for them? So I think that's, it's looking at what the physical needs are, for the aged assets, but also looking at what are the needs of the residents and crafting programs, and also trying to leverage local and state and federal financing agencies to help provide the resident services funds for those type of programs. I think that's also a big challenge, getting the financial institutions to recognize that investing in your residents creates a better asset, not only for the physical asset of these buildings, but also for the community and the neighborhood.
Great. So again, it's one-dimensional isn't going to do the job. Yeah. Carol?
Yeah, what I guess I would add is thinking about it from a neighborhood perspective, particularly neighborhoods that are under pressure because rents are going up overall in a community in these high knowledge economy places with lots of job growth, that the importance of existing deed restricted housing, whether that's HUD assisted or low income housing tax credit, as a stabilizer for that community, both adding some of that, but definitely preserving what you already have in those communities, elevating that connection in terms of the displacement and its importance, not just at your local level, but all the way up to the HUD level. Because I know that I have, now that I'm on the outside, I get calls from developers that are trying to get a new project-based Section 8 contract, with higher rents approved from HUD, and HUD is resisting in terms of the costs, right? But you're in a neighborhood where, like, if you don't do that, as an owner, they really, they're going to let that contract go, right? And so recognizing and getting the federal government to recognize that in these communities, we have to be thinking very thoughtfully about the importance of preserving that housing, even if it costs like a little bit more than you would want it to cost. So that's one thing. The other is the whole concept of these communities under pressure and adding to the supply in these neighborhoods and getting the economic incentives right at the local level to do an inclusionary kind of development, to do a mixed income development. And I'm thinking more of a market-driven development with an affordable component and making sure that the locality gets the requirements for inclusionary units and the economic incentives to make that work for the developer right. And we've done this little dashboard, which I think helps communities look at that calculus in a way that is helpful. And I think we need more of that kind of information out there to help people.
I've also wondered in that context whether we're starting to have the data tools to see the market pressures coming early enough to do some property acquisition, some land banking, to get in ahead before the price pressures are so intense that it costs a whole lot more. A couple of questions here are saying, how much it costs to build affordable housing in these high-cost cities, and is that a good use of scarce subsidy resources?
So I think the cost of construction and development, and you can speak more to this, is huge, and some of those come from public sector fees, et cetera, and new requirements. Some of it comes from lack of labor. There's just a whole, and digging into actually understanding each and every one of those components, something that I really want to spend some time doing because I think it's important to understand. But we're really looking at how can you scale up off-site modular construction for multifamily in a big way, where I know you can save 20% on the cost of construction. It's not easily integrated into the existing financial system or the existing development process. So working on those kinds of issues. But I do think we've got to spend the money, to ensure that we're getting new housing supply that's affordable in all places.
The modular idea has some appeal because it could be applied by private sector developers who are not subsidized.
Absolutely.
Some with shallow subsidy, and then some nonprofit developers looking for deeper subsidy.
No, absolutely. I think that in New York, modular housing has been done in some case studies in terms of doing that, particularly within Midtown Manhattan on some new models and having a wonderful plant in Brooklyn where a lot of those units were put together. So again, creating a great economic tool and resource that would help transform and continue to galvanize communities. But to go back to the question in terms of should we continue to build affordable housing in high opportunity areas? Absolutely. Because you're forgetting that this is, well, not forgetting, but acknowledging that the workforce needs to be accessible to their jobs. And it's not just an high income workforce, right? It's folks that are at the multiple layers within the corporations and these organizations that need to get access. Unless there's a great transportation system that is bringing folks from the outer boroughs and into the heart of the city for jobs, which does not exist in all of the high opportunity communities. So the answer to that is absolutely.
So I just got two questions that I think we should tackle, and I'm going to put them both out because I don't want to run out of time. So one is, we've been talking really a lot about sort of hot market cities and the hottest housing markets within them. And so at least one person here is really interested in what could be described as legacy cities or cities that are still have weaker markets, more affordable, but still experiencing some of the distress of past decades. And then another question that I think is really important is really a question of whether proximity is sufficient to ensure inclusion and access to opportunity. And whether I think you've touched on this already in thinking about resident services, but what else do we need to be thinking of in revitalizing communities and opportunity-rich communities that have historically been exclusive. If we can achieve the affordable housing development, what more do we need to do to achieve real inclusion and opportunity? So take whichever one you want. You want to start?
I'll just jump in on the neighborhoods that have traditionally been lower income and disinvested in. I think having those communities lifted up with new people, new jobs, new commercial activities, there is a benefit. I don't know that there's evidence of this. I'm just saying it, okay? So I'm not putting my researcher hat on. But I actually would say to step back. I would say I know you've done some work in this area, but really the evidence about what you need to do in these communities that ensures success, I think is not as well. The evidence is not as well developed as, say, the Raj Shetty evidence on mobility, and that doesn't mean there isn't benefit. It's just we don't actually know. I like to quote Dr. Megan Sandoval always talks about the housing dosage. Like, we don't know what the dosage of things are, what the right medicine is, and what the right dosage is to really make these neighborhoods work. But I do intuit that at least there is some benefit just by being in proximity. Lower crime rates, right? That we know that means less stress for families where there's lower crime. Access to transportation to your job, we know, reliable transportation, we know that creates less stress. So there are some things that we know, but I think there is just much more that we need to know.
And it's tremendously difficult to draw generalizable lessons about those neighborhood revitalization strategies, because this is something Shaun Donovan said. Each one has to be tailored to the local circumstances. So from a researcher's perspective, it's like evaluating a bunch of snowflakes.
And I think with the work that we've done, just taking the Mid-Atlantic region as an example, we cover Pennsylvania through North Carolina, and the communities that we deal with. Baltimore is very different, has a different set of issues than DC. Richmond, Virginia, has a whole new set of issues. So you can't take one size fit all, but what's important is looking at what the needs of that community are and proper investment, not just in the housing. It really is, I think, one of the great things that came out of choice neighborhoods and pushing, a push to change how we look at public assisted housing and public housing is that it's just not about the housing. It really takes all the stakeholders, education, criminal justice, health, who are your local anchors, to really figure out, what are the strategies that you can improve that neighborhood. And, leaving the lower income neighborhoods off the list doesn't make any sense, because at the end of the day, that is still a workforce, that is people who should have and have the right to have access to quality, affordable housing, and a community that is producing and is generating, and I mean, that's just a critical.
Yeah. So before we need to wrap up, I think we got one question that's a very nitty-gritty question, I think, but it relates to these challenges of inclusion, revitalization, and avoiding the risk of displacement. So this person is working in the context of a neighborhood that has already experienced significant displacement as it becomes a more high opportunity neighborhood. And they're struggling to ensure that statewide density bonuses don't exacerbate that problem of displacement because the high income housing that's being introduced to the neighborhood to achieve income mixing is essentially outstripping the affordable housing production and preservation. So this sort of gets to, I've got all these concepts, I'm trying to do it on the ground, and I'm running into barriers. Ideas about how to tackle this? Do you want to start?
Well, I would just say, this may get into an ideological, philosophical issue, but I find it difficult in today's form of, let's call it gentrification. This is not your 1970s, we're clearing a neighborhood with public investment and we're putting up a bunch of new hotels that are literally displacing people, right? We have a new dynamic in the displacement challenges, I think, in neighborhoods today, which in my view comes from some of the stats I read at the beginning. We have huge population growth in these cities, both from jobs and from internal population growth. And so when you're adding supply to these neighborhoods, you may be adding higher income people. You've got to be looking at strategies to help folks stay in place in some of these apartments or homes that exist. And there may be some, what I call demand side subsidies that we need to look at there. I'm working on something right now where we're talking about, and I think Enterprise and others have talked about this, use of the tax code for, rental subsidies, like instead of vouchers. I mean, we need to think about those kinds of strategies where the gentrification is happening because of rent pressure on an entire community, because more people want to live there and more people are there and need to have a place to live. And so you need to add to the supply, but you may need to help people who can't afford those rents afford those rents.
And this really takes, speaks to collaboration when policies are made at a state level with little input for localities, or coordination with the local cities and how policies are being implemented is very critical. So I'm just going to take a step back. In New York, being a mature market for New York, if there's a significant amount of coordination and lessons learned, and actually it was under Commissioner Donovan when we were all there, that he coordinated to make sure that policies that were being implemented at the state level were also in coordination with the city. And it's that communication that is sometimes missing, I think, in a lot of, in our discussions about housing policy. It comes from a strong advocacy from the housing groups and the organizations, but there still needs to be support from the cities.
So I think we're close to running out of time. Another question that has come from the audience really in some ways talks about the inclusion of the nonprofit sector in this work. And we've talked a little bit about how tackling this challenge on a big, sustainable scale requires market actors and outside the market, or subsidized and mission-driven actors. Do you feel that in some of these hot market settings, the nonprofit sector is being kind of crowded out of the conversation, or and how should we be tackling that challenge?
Ooh, that's a good question. The quick answer to that is yes. But it's a tough question because as the market had its challenges several years ago, we saw a lot of our nonprofits, our local-based nonprofit organizations suffer and begin to have their own financial challenges with existing. So at the local level, I think we have the nonprofit market has had some challenges in figuring out how to reconfigure itself. Intermediary, LISC and Enterprise and others have really tried to help reframe the conversation with nonprofit organizations to not just be neighborhood-based, but be more from a city-based, or expand your horizons, come together as a collaborative and figure out what types of loan funds or that you can leverage together as a larger nonprofit organization. Organizations like myself have been able to partner with smaller organizations, nonprofits. I do think that it is a challenge for nonprofits to be agile and to mobilize as a for-profit developer. But if you have the right resources and tools and access to the necessary resources, that you can be competitive. But it's just, quite honestly, it's just very difficult. We're able to leverage an allocation, being a CDFI, having an allocation of new market tax credits, having had NSP2 at our disposal to really run and get on the ground very quickly in certain neighborhoods, but not every local nonprofit has that ability. And so looking at larger loan funds and acquisition funds and land banking, I mean, that's stuff that has been around for so many years that we have to push those resources, and we have to make sure that those resources are properly funded. But it's a challenge.
Can I just add one point to that?
Absolutely.
Because I think that it's probably less the market challenge for nonprofits. And actually, there could be an opportunity now that the market is better and tax base in communities are better. It's the lack of resources. So you guys did a calculator on the gap, you know, to build an affordable housing development. And the gap resources are fewer, the availability are fewer, and I think tackling that issue, both with the cost side, but also, you know, let's just face it, we need more resources at the federal, state, and local level, and maybe now that communities are doing better, I know in California, you know, San Francisco just passed a $315 million affordable housing bond, and many of the other counties have bonds on there, you know, to fund affordable housing, to create some new gap sources of financing. And maybe there's an opportunity with the market better to try to get some more resources.
Yeah, so it's a scaling up,
a
not
scaling
only
up.
of capacity and policy tools, but also of resources. Fundamentally, it can't happen without resources. We're going to close this session. I just want to return us to a point that Shaun Donovan made as we close, because I feel this conversation has really reinforced his optimism that if we work together across policy domains and across geographic scales, but for a long time. This isn't quick response work. This is sustained work. And if we're willing to learn from the evidence and make mid-course corrections because we're holding ourselves accountable, we really can make real progress. And we're seeing that progress starting to happen in a lot of places. Progress that really expands opportunities for economic mobility for everybody, including the people in the communities that have historically been left behind. So it's terrific to learn from both of you, and we look forward to the rest of the day.
So I'm going to encourage you a very brief recaffeination, rehydration, and bio break. We are going to resume back here in 10 minutes, and recall that there'll be a time at lunch for everyone to spend time talking to all the fabulous colleagues in the room. So I do want to keep us moving along so we don't get behind schedule for the Attorney General. See you back in 10 minutes. Thank you.